Shall we get going? Sound people, are we ready to go? Is Alan, our virtual panelist with us?
Recording in progress.
Hello, Alan. Hello, Alan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Anton Harbour from the Campaign for Free Expression. We have an excellent panel this morning. The starting point is the report that we're releasing today on the state of free expression in South Africa, 2024. It's our second annual report on the situation. And this one is titled A Need for Vigilance, which I think sums up part of the core message. I'm going to ask Alan Finlay, who's here virtually, who compiled the report, to give us an introduction to it. Is his presentation going to be projected over there? Okay, and we'll see it here, I hope. So he'll give us an introduction to the report. I will then move on to our panelists to ask them to highlight any issues, raise any issues, add to it any thoughts they have on the current situation. We have Ismail Mohammed, well known from the world of arts and culture, and a member of the board of CFE. So I'm sure he'll speak about that aspect of it. With me, many of you will know Daria Milo, attorney, media attorney, very well known for his work in this area of free expression and media freedom. Patusa Magopeni, broadcaster, former head of news at SABC. In other words, she's a recovering SABC head of news. We work together at ENCA as well, so we go back a bit. It's great to see a number of old friends here and hopefully some new friends that we will meet. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. I'll tell you in 2 sentences about Campaign for Free Expression. We're quite a new young organization that's operating now in 5 countries across Southern Africa, a footprint we hope to enlarge. And the name of our organization says exactly what we do: defend and build free expression across these countries. One of the things we do is we do a report on each of those 5 countries. Botswana, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and South Africa. So the first thing we do to give us a factual base for our work, a research base, is a close look at the state of free expression in each of those countries. And it's extremely interesting because each of them have their own particular situations but share a lot in common. So it's quite useful to look at them together. All of, in your packs today, you should get the South African one, and the others are all available online on our site if you wish to find them. So I'm going to hand over to Alan. Alan is a researcher of some experience and note, and he played the key role in compiling this report. Alan.
Thanks, Anton. On a technical issue, I should share a presentation, right? Through my share screen options.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm going to do that. From beginning, steady, just do this quickly. There we go. Can you see that fine? Is my presentation showing?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks. So I've got about 5 minutes just to go through some of the top level findings of the report, and thanks for the introduction, Anton. So to say the time frame was a year, so our previous report was for 5 years. This was from September last year until the end of August this year. And as you'll freedom, the elections, the targeted killings, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, protests, and legislative and policy developments. Um, this relies on reported incidents, so we respond to what's reported, media statements by rights organizations, research reports, databases such as the one kept by the Institute for Security Studies. But this issue also includes an analysis of media coverage that we did of protest action by ground up. The report shows that a number of the threats to freedom of expression that were identified in our previous report have carried over into this year, which is not entirely unexpected, but it's interesting to note that these trends continue. And for instance, when we come to top-level findings, trends in threats that prevent journalists reporting freely via item signed within the field have continued. The attacks are mostly by the police, but public and political parties. In this last year, the gendered nature of many of these attacks on journalists have been noted. And with respect to that, this is something that we've known in the past, particularly online, but what's been highlighted now more is by organizations like SANEF, or SANEF in particular, is attacks on female journalists when going out into the field, which raises questions about the future of women in journalism in this country. Notably, one of the incidents involved the MK party, who have in the past also, recently in the past, but also the supporters of Zuma shown the ill treatment of journalists. So the MK party, together with EFF, need to be watched, in particular in terms of their attitudes to journalists and media freedom. New draft legislation extending the surveillance capabilities of the State Security Agency, and we're talking about QLAB here, which all of you are aware about. And just to say, there have been some positive developments, such as the criminal defamation being repealed in the new Judicial Matters Amendment Act, and the law is historically been used to restrict free speech and silence journalists. During this period, the independence of the public broadcaster came under question. There were three issues here. One was the SABC bill, which, amongst other things, plans to give overall editorial responsibility to the CEO, which we've seen previously at the SABC. We saw state security vetting the head of news at the SABC during elections. He was also asked to take a polygraph test, which he refused. And the polygraph has been described by the government in the past as a mechanism to test loyalty to the state. And the SABC also refused to air an advert by the Democratic Alliance during the elections, and that was the flag-burning advertisement. Politically motivated assassinations. This is a very strange thing we've got used to in South Africa. There was one assassination on average every 2 weeks in the run-up to the elections, which is quite startling, really. And this combined with the violent protests that disrupted electoral processes in communities meant that many South Africans are likely to have voted in the context of intimidation and fear. This is in the context of declaring the elections free and fair, but we always need to obviously bear in mind these assassinations and the community violence that occurs. Online attacks on journalists during the elections were considered a greater threat to media freedoms than incidents in the field, although there was one important one at an MK rally that happened where journalists were harassed and assaulted. And notably here, there was little help from the big technology platforms. When SANEF approached them to deal with this potential threat of online attacks before the elections.
Alan, do you want to move to the next? Alan, do you want to move to the next
yes,
slide? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice my marking text. Public protests. There were 703 public protests recorded across the country during the period, the 1-year period, or nearly 2 a day. So clearly it remains a vital form of free expression in South Africa. Some of them, of course, turned violent. And I was actually surprised to read in one report we analyzed that the protesters were armed. So the police obviously have a difficult job in many circumstances. However, our analysis suggests that that when police do intervene in protests, there remains a reasonable chance that the rights of protesters and bystanders will be infringed. In our analysis of articles, which was 91 articles, 91 reports of protests done by ground up, in 10% of for the community. And these interventions are violent too. A lot of people got rubber bullets, stun grenades, arrests, and so on. The numerous forms of pro-Palestinian solidarity protests in this country have been peacefully, have gone ahead peacefully, and this is in marked contrast, as we know, to the many what's happening in many developed countries in terms of free expression and pro-Palestinian positions. However, in this country, there were also a couple of incidents that need to be questioned in terms of freedom of expression, including one that many of us know about, involving the under-19 cricket captain. The SABC's Metro FM cancelling an interview with the Jewish survivor of the October 7th attacks by Hamas in Israel, and one involving a coloring book at Exclusive Books that was supportive of the Palestinians in Gaza that was apparently taken off the shelves by Exclusive Books. SLAPP legislation, this we recorded in the previous year, and it again has happened in this period, the previous period, 5-year period, and again in this period. It shows the ongoing use of the courts by some businesses to try silence reporting and other forms of public exposure, and both the incidents that we record here involve foreign companies. And lastly, we also touch on media sustainability, which has been described as dysfunctional, the media environment, largely due to the harvesting of advertising revenue by big tech. And here one example was Media 24 saying that Google takes 95% generated by news content at News 24. And of course, what this does is threaten the capacity of the media to report in the public interest, and therefore has implications for freedom of expression. So as you'll see, we've tried to cover quite a range of issues, and there are many cross-cutting issues in discussing expanding on and discussing these issues. We identify environmental activism, art and culture funding, gender, information, disinformation, and so on. Thanks, Anton. That's quite high level, but that's a summary.
Thank you very much. Everyone has a copy, and there's digital copies available on our website, so they can catch up on the detail. But thank you, Alan, for a report. I think you've given a sense of how much ground has to be covered, and it illustrates just how necessary it is to be watching all of these areas as they impinge on issues of free expression. Ismail, I'm going to ask you to jump in and ask for your thoughts on the sphere you work in.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. The only reason I'm sitting away from you is because I have a cold. So just a note for the technicians, you've got to sanitize this mic before you hand it over to the next person. Thank you very much for the report by Alan. It's an extensive report, but I'm going to talk specifically around the chapter that he has on arts and culture. And then I'll address the question of media that writes about the arts. In 1996, when the white paper on arts and culture was adopted through a broad-based public consultation basis with the cultural and creative industries, that signaled an element of hope because it would indicate the way arm's-length funding of the arts would be directed and how arts organizations would be governed. But that was not a hope that lasted very, very long, because soon after that, the act was amended in 2003, the Cultural Institutions Amendment Act, which where previously the public had the right to nominate members of a council for a cultural institution, and the council itself that would be publicly interviewed, the members of the council would be publicly interviewed. That stopped happening. And the chairpersons of the councils were no longer appointed by the members of the council themselves, but were appointed by the minister. And that was a serious level of interference, because it no longer left control and governance of the organizations in the hands of the council and the operations in the hands of management. It simply meant that the Minister of Art and Culture would have a more direct influence over the council because he appoints the chairperson, he directs that, what happens. but also that apart from the council chairperson reporting directly to the minister, the business plans of the institutions also needed to be approved by the minister. And where institutions previously were considered in terms of the original white paper on arts and culture as institutions of the public, all the institutions that are now governed by the Act, which includes the Market Theatre, which has a history of free expression, all have to carry at the entrance an agency of the state. And that becomes incredibly problematic because it reflects the kind of changed philosophy in terms of how those organizations operate and how the kind of content that gets presented in those particular institutions, but also who gets appointed to those particular institutions. I just want to get through a few points here. And then in 2008, President Jacob Zuma convened a meeting at the Johannesburg Convention Center, and he mooted for the formation of a single federation that would govern the arts, and that all members who work in the cultural and creative industries needed to be registered members of the federation, and that the federation would work very, very closely with the DAC to determine funding policy, who gets funded, who doesn't get funded, and so forth. The organization CIFSA, which is short for Cultural and Creative Industries Federation, is literally a violation of the South African Constitution around freedom of association. Because freedom of association means that you have the right to join any organization, but you also have the right not to be a member of an organization. So to prescribe for all artists that you have to be members of the organization in order to engage with the Department of Arts and Culture and in order to be able to receive funding is incredibly problematic, and that has not been challenged by any rights-based organization. CIFSA now in its website since the beginning of this year has added a clause to say that it is an independent organization in terms of the Companies Act. However, in its historical statement and its mission statement, it does state very clearly that it was established by the DAC, it continues to be funded by the DAC, and its original members' interim committee was appointed by the DAC as well. In 2010, with Minister Lulu Tsigwana, we saw an increase in censorship of artists, and one particular case that stands out is the exhibition about lesbian women, a photographic exhibition that was in the Concord. 2012, the Brett Murray Spear controversy, and an increased grip around satirical work in South Africa. As a result, we also saw that all state institutions began to soften the kind of exhibitions that are presented at public-funded institutions, but at independent, funding-dependent organizations. And I'm talking about organizations that are not state organizations. There was also a softening of content, largely because of fear that if you present work that challenges the state, you're not going to get any kind of funding. During the tenure of Nathi Mthethwa, and with Vusi Mkhize appointed as the Director General for the Department of Arts and Culture, we saw a greater interference in the freedom of exercise around art and culture. We saw high levels of funding patronage, and we saw blacklists reaching its peak. And among some of that was the blacklisting of Charles Blichnout, who was a City Press editor, arts journalist, from being blacklisted by the Department of Arts and Culture for his critical exposés of dysfunctionality within state institutions. We saw defamation of character by Nathi Mthethwa, of Mike van der Graan, a renowned playwright and arts critic, where Nathi Mthethwa issued a statement on his Facebook page stating that the only reason Mike van der Graan was bitter is because he requested the minister to become his advisor, and the minister did not offer that. Mike van der Graan challenged the minister to provide evidence of that, and to date, the DAC or the Minister Natim Tetwa, or any subsequent minister has not provided any kind of evidence like that. So that kind of defamation of character of arts people who spoke out against the DAC was on the increase. We saw an increased number of forensic audits at institutions where either artistic directors or CEOs or board members of those councils began to challenge the DAC. In most cases, those forensic audits were failed audits. They could not go any further. In 2017, when I was the CEO of the Market Theatre, together with the CFO, Christine MacDonald, we invoked the Protectors Disclosures Act, and we whistle blew on the Market Theatre Council, who were dipping their hands into the coffers to pay themselves rates which were in contradiction of the Treasury regulations, despite bringing close to about 2,000 pages of evidence to the DAC and to Natim Tetwa. They did nothing about it until we had to whistleblow, and a case that took almost 3 years to sort itself out in one, which we won with every charge of theirs falling flat on its face. We've also seen the dismissal of dancer and choreographer Mamela Nyamsa, a renowned South African choreographer and dancer, who was dismissed as the artistic director of the State Theatre by the council for outspoken criticism of the Artscape Theatre, which is an institution of the state as well. But just recently, we've seen also artist complicity in censorship. A notable case is this year when the artistic director of the Baxter Theatre, Lara Foot, tried to silence criticism of her work, Othello, which she said deals with issues of decoloniality. She invited an audience to engage with it, and when Mike van Graan did engage with it, she shut him down, closed discussion, and blocked him from the theatre's Facebook page. And that is quite ironical because the Baxter Theatre is not an institution of the state like the Market Theatre, the State Theatre, Artscape, or whatever. It's a theatre that is on a university campus, funded by a university campus, and it becomes incredibly worrisome when a university-based theatre shuts down debate and discussion. Just last week, we've seen the Good Book Appreciation Society shutting down and then blocking acclaimed novelist Joanne Joseph. In July this year, we've seen the Film and Publications Board put a classification of 18 plus on the latest film about Zapiro Showerhead, an acclaimed little film that was premiered at the Durban International Film Festival. Now that is incredibly worrisome when a film like that gets an 18 plus classification. One would expect that an audience 16 to 18 needs to receive exposure to political information because to ready them for being able to vote. The book, Alan spoke about the book that was pulled off the shelves from exclusive books, River to Sea. There have been numerous cases. I can go through about 50 cases of censorship in South Africa since the Cultural Amendment Laws Act was promulgated. We've also seen for the last 3 years a failure to adopt the new revised white paper on arts and culture, which has been sitting at the DAC for at least 4 years collecting dust. Now, what is incredibly worrisome for us as an arts and culture department, I spoke earlier about that a lot of the censorship came about when Vusi Mkhize was the Director General to the Department of Arts and Culture. Vusi Mkhize is presently the CEO of the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, when one considers that the PSP debacle that Alan writes about in this report, the protests by artists, the sit-in at the National Arts Council, all happened under the watch of Vusi Mkhize when he was Director General. What hope is there for the arts sector that the Commission itself would stand up to defend the arts when it's necessary to do so? What is even more worrisome is that the National Arts Festival, which for more than 40 years held an open fringe for artists. When I talk about an open fringe, it's any artist could register to present work at the National Arts Festival, provided you pay for the venue and your basic registration fee to be included in the promotional content and collateral of the festival. The festival, due to funding constraints, no longer presents an open fringe. It presents a selected fringe, which means artists have to apply, a committee selects the productions, which now means that there is no open fringe for any artist in South Africa. But just a fortnight ago, there was a worrisome response from the Department of Arts and Culture at the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Arts and Culture when they were asked the question around their performance rate around internationalization of the arts. We know that a large number of South African artists are making it incredibly well on the international stages, but they don't do that with the support of the Department of Arts and Culture or any other state funding institution. Artists like Reggie Makoma, Dada Masilo, Brett Bailey find money through corporate sector or through other fundraising efforts. The DAC's response on the question of internationalization and the low performance was that they did not receive any invitation as officials to attend any international function. Now, this is incredibly worrisome because they are noted for turning down applications by artists who are invited to perform at international festivals. So you ask about the appointment of Gayton McKenzie, a right-wing populist politician who seems to be gaining traction and the admiration of a large part of the arts sector. And you ask yourself, why? Are we schizophrenic? That a cultural sector that is political, that is progressive, would see a man like that as salvation. That's largely because a sector that is so hurt, so destroyed, that is struggling to find funding to sustain itself, more so after the destruction of so much of our resources during the COVID-19 lockdowns, when for almost 2.5 years, the entire industry was shut down. Anyone who comes out holding some amount of cash in his hand and throwing it there is going to be seen as salvation for hungry artists. It's the politics of the stomach. Whether that would work out is dependent on what Gayton McKenzie announces in the next 2 days, where he said he's calling a press conference to announce his 10-point plan. Now, for me, what is more worrying than the state control or the state manipulation or the state's destruction of freedom of expression and freedom of creativity in the cultural sector is the decline that we have in progressive and critical writing about the arts in the media. And we can understand that due to funding constraints, it's the last point, due to funding constraints of the media, that most media are now depending on publicity copy that poses as arts journalism. The media is our last hope, but we expect you to turn publicity copy into critical arts journalism, because freedom of expression, freedom of creativity, and the health of our democracy depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you. You touched on a great deal there and a great deal of important things. So thank you very much. Quite a lot there to think about and to be concerned about. Dario, let's come to you. A lot of what's dealt with is legislative, new laws, law amendments, and how those play out in the courts. So how do you see the situation?
Thank you, Anton, and it's a great pleasure to be here. See some very familiar faces as well in the audience, so very nice to be here. I would like to focus specifically on the issue of slaps in particular, because although we don't yet have legislation on slaps, I'm going to argue that we should prioritize lobbying for such legislation. And I want to focus on three things. First, I'll talk about the South African position on slaps at the moment, where we don't have legislation, but where we really have some excellent sort of law and starting points, departure points for arguing for legislation on slaps. Secondly, I want to briefly talk about international developments and why this is really a pivotal moment to prioritize as activists and as truth tellers the importance of slap legislation. And thirdly, I'll end then just with concluding how I think South Africa can once again punch above its weight in this area and lead the way for the rest of the African continent, if I may say so. So firstly, in relation to where South Africa is at the moment, there was a breakthrough 2 years ago in the mineral sands case, and that was a classic sort of setup for a slap, in the sense that you had the ingredients of what is commonly seen to be a slap: a large multinational, a foreign corporation, although with South African presence, suing for defamation a number of activists in South Africa who needed pro bono legal assistance, couldn't defend themselves in terms of the costs of litigation. And then we acted with our pro bono department for these activists and argued that the common law, so not legislation, we don't have legislation, but the common law should recognize an anti-slap defense as an abuse of process. Because at the end of the day, what slaps are, as the acronym suggests, strategic lawsuits. Unfortunately, it's an American term, which everyone's inherited, but strategic lawsuits against public participation, slaps. The acronym says it all. It is the attempt by powerful, whether it's a corporation or politicians or business, to stifle criticism, to stifle public participation. And so it's an abuse, because it's not someone saying, I've genuinely been defamed and I want vindication. I want the world to know I'm not a thief or guilty of corruption. It's someone saying, I am using the law, I'm weaponizing the law to teach you a lesson for criticizing me, and to send a message to everyone else that if you do this, I'm going to sue you. And I always use Zuma as a classic example, in my view. His litigation spree against the media, which Janet will be very familiar with, and others from many years ago, would now be characterized, I should say, as a slap, because there was never any intention, in my view, for him to take those matters further. It was really just to hang over the heads of the media. So where we are 2 years ago is the ConCourt adopts the argument that there should be a abuse of process defense. You can argue, if you sued, certainly in a defamation case, you can argue that this is a slap, and that the motive in bringing the case was to prevent legitimate criticism, right? The next step is the Karen Moore case, which everyone knows about. Zuma weaponizing the law in the form of a private prosecution. And of course, as you know, he attempted to privately prosecute Karen Moore as well as Billy Downer, but the Karen Moore case is particularly important for the media. And so this is essentially a private citizen saying, the NPA didn't prosecute. I'm now prosecuting because, you remember his convoluted argument that by disclosing a letter in his affidavit, by Karen Moore writing about that letter, which was essentially to justify seeking a postponement on health grounds. In his criminal case, she was effectively breaching a really dusty and unused provision of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, and that's a criminal offense, said Zuma, even though he was the one who put the letter in the public court record by putting it in his affidavit. And by the way, the letter didn't even disclose his medical condition, so it was really the most non-privacy of privacy points to take. In that case, Zuma's legal team argued, when Karen Moore challenged this as a slap, argued that the mineral sands case only applied to civil cases, and this was a criminal case. Fortunately, the KwaZulu-Natal court and the Supreme Court of Appeal on appeal said that the slap principle applies to criminal cases as well as civil cases. So we've got a great grounding for us to now argue that we need legislation to set the stage for detailed slap legislation. Because although these court cases give a weapon to litigators acting for the media, acting for activists to say, let's try and argue the slap defense, they're very high level. And ultimately what experience from around the world teaches us, which I'm coming to now, is that you do need detail in the rules of litigation, in legislation, to properly address the slap problem. So the second point I want to emphasize, and I'm not going to get into the detail of this, but around the world there are developments at the moment where a number of countries are looking at whether anti-slap legislation is needed. And as a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, which is part of the Media Freedom Coalition, who are co-hosts here, I'm happy to see today. We're looking at the issue of SLAPPs as a real priority for the high-level panel. And you'll see the European Union has passed a directive saying member states have to pass laws to address SLAPPs. The Council of Europe has issued a recommendation on anti-SLAPP laws. The UK has a sort of a version for economic crimes that they've legislated, where you can address SLAPPs where reporting has happened in economic crimes context. Ireland has just passed or is considering an amendment to their defamation laws which will address SLAPPs. And even in the US, which is the sort of grandfather of SLAPP law, and where most states have SLAPP legislation, there are moves to create harmony amongst the states so that there's not kind of the lowest common denominator, but quite robust protection against SLAPPs in every state. So it's a pivotal moment, I think, in the last year or two for us as South Africa, and this is my final point and my third point in conclusion, to say, let's use this momentum. Let's use the fact that we've got effectively the sanction of the Constitutional Court saying there is a problem here, and we're going to try address it in the limited way we can as a court. But let's take that learning forward, I think, and lobby for legislation. Already, the Center for Applied Legal Studies has a draft out there, a sort of model law against SLAPPs, which can be the starting point for engagement. And just as happened in the criminal defamation context, which Alan spoke about, where eventually and very belatedly and against the curve of the rest of the African continent, we finally decriminalized defamation. I think with SLAPPs we have the opportunity to say, let's lead the way in the African continent. Let's mobilize around the momentum against SLAPPs worldwide, off the back of stories like that of Daphne Galizia being assassinated in Malta, Russian oligarchs suing for defamation in the UK. And we've got our own stories here. And the last point I'd make is that in order to create the atmosphere for persuading legislatures or for advancing the common law, we need those stories. We need empirical data. And the CFE report is sort of a part of that, which is to say, for members of the media, for activists out there, you need to report to your industry bodies when you believe that a SLAPP is being perpetrated on you, because the collection of that data, in addition to then mobilizing resources around it, legal resources and others, is, I think, quite crucial. So thank you, Anton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Patiswa, over to you.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you, panelists. For me, it's quite interesting that you said I'm not recovering from my CBC person. It is actually the case. I think for me, before I get to the other stuff, I think on the SABC matters that come off the report, I think the issue of vigilance and need for vigilance is quite crucial if you look at the happenings at the public broadcaster. Much as I'm still part of that arrangement via board, but I do think that the presence and the vigilance of civil society and the public is critical to the strengthening of that entity. Just the first one on the SABC bill, I see that in the report there are references to the head of news because the authority of decision-making in terms of the SABC bill is like to go back to the CEO, which is something that was changed in 2020 when the policies were revised. And there is a gap that was never addressed before the policies were published. But it doesn't make the other move to take back authority of editorial decision making. It doesn't make it right. But what actually happened was once you locate editorial decision making in the office of the head of news, you leave out all other editorial decision making around entertainment and programming exposed. There's no one who accounts for that. And in fact, one of the examples is already in the report, the interview that was canned by Metro FM It fell out of the news domain. It was done by programming. But in that case, the editorial decision-making wouldn't have been a responsibility of the head of news, because the head of news is not responsible for that. So there are areas that have been left exposed as a result of locating that authority within the news division, which is correct, but it means that there's a different mechanism that's required to cover all other areas that require editorial decision-making, because entertainment content, we've had cases where the public would be taking the SABC on matters of misrepresentation of cultural expression and all that in entertainment. But that wouldn't be the responsibility of the head of news to actually make calls on that. So that's one area that that's a gap in the policies. I'm not going to address the issue of vetting, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on there. But just a reference to what I believed to be either incompetence or the clumsiness with which the SAA has been doing vetting, because I was vetted. And it was before elections when I was vetted, even though I had submitted all the documents when I was appointed in March. In August, I got this message on Facebook. It's on Messenger. It was at 1:30, 13th August 2018. Good afternoon. And the person says, I'm working for SSA, and I would like to confirm if you are still working for SABC. Actually, I have your file to conduct your vetting. Please call me on the following numbers as soon as you get this message. That's how my vetting was coordinated, via Facebook Messenger. But this person has my file. He knows exactly where to find me, that I work for the SABC. So you have these things that are happening, much as there is real outrage around what was being done, but there is also clumsiness and all the other stuff that has been happening in how these vetting processes have been conducted. But I think on the issues that have been raised about intimidation of journalists, I think for me, freedom of expression is not just about what is happening outside media houses, by politicians, by businesses, or any other person who's trying to intimidate journalists and erode freedom of expression in media freedom. There is a danger that's sitting within newsrooms that we're not paying attention to. One, it's media owners, the interest of media owners in the content that's being produced. And in fact, it's been playing out on two stories. It's geopolitical issues, Russia and Ukraine, Gaza and Israel. And that's where you actually get to see where media interest, the interest of media owners lie in the editorial decision-making in newsrooms. So that is one part, and we need to pay attention to that, because these may be the two big stories. What else is happening locally in the coverage of different stories locally that get to be sanctioned by media owners? So that's one part. And the other part is also linked to sustainability of the media, because the pressures have meant that there are stories that the newsrooms are going to walk away from because they could jeopardize advertising and sponsorship that's coming, that should be coming if they don't cover the stories. And so those are things that in fact, media sustainability is actually coming up as a huge threat to freedom of expression and media freedom. And one other thing that also resides within newsrooms, it's journalistic independence. We talk a lot about editorial independence, which is the domain of editors in the main. But you can ask journalists and they will tell you, and actually they are going around seeking help about what they see as censorship within newsrooms. So because there's also no agency, or there is no structure in the sector that deals with issues of censorship, we only speak about it, and it will play out in some form, but no one actually gets to deal with that as an industry body. You have the two entities being the Business SA and the Press Council. They are post-fact platforms. So the public goes there to report issues on matters that have been reported already. But what about the stories that get killed within newsrooms, and that journalists end up taking instructions on what not to report on? Either it's linked to economic sustainability of the media, or it's other things that have nothing to do with the newsrooms themselves. So those are things that I do think that actually need attention. The other part is the decline of journalistic literacy in newsrooms. And this is linked to lack of due diligence in newsrooms. It's lack of duty of loyalty in the newsrooms, and the duty of care in the newsrooms. And it plays out in different spaces because you have entities that expect journalists to have huge following on social media platforms. And part of that following includes politicians and people they are supposed to report on. They become friends on social media. And how do you report on these people when you're having conversations on social media? Where's your independence when you have to interrogate the lives of these people and how they conduct themselves in the spaces where they are supposed to be serving the public? So that is one area that I've observed. But the whole thing around journalistic literacy is not about how the public understands the media. It's how the media conducts itself in telling the stories that they tell, that you have the due care, you have the questions that are being asked, you have the verification that needs to be done, and that your loyalty actually is to the citizens, not the people that you're reporting on, and including the media house that you work for. So your loyalty is to the public that you serve or to the audiences that you serve and not the media house that you work for. And I know that the biggest problem is job security. Journalists are scared of challenging editors on any issues that they would ordinarily try to raise, because unlike what we saw during the times of Pesel Koboza whose life is being memorialized this week with Black Wednesday, unlike what they did at the time and they ended up in jails, the new jail is job security. No one is going to jail. People are protecting their livelihoods by walking away and overlooking things that they are supposed to be questioning. So I do think that it's something that the sector needs to pay attention to because it's important to the continued existence of the sector. Yes, the whole issue around media sustainability is a huge problem. We may sit and talk about big tech and what it has done to erode our revenues. And while we sit and try and find solutions, as it has happened with Australia and other countries like Canada and others who are still in the process, including ourselves with the Commission of Inquiry that is just concluded, or we're still waiting for the report on that, big tech is actually ahead of us. We need to start thinking ourselves out of the problem, rather than sitting in this space and thinking, how are we going to maneuver to the extent that we get what we need? What I foresee, you have Google that may commit, as they've done in other countries, they may commit to a fund that's going to sustain the media. What we're not thinking of is, if they could give that money to the media, what stops them from setting up their own news enterprise? Down the line, instead of paying the media, they could easily end up setting their own news enterprises because they've got the money. So instead of giving that money to the media, they could end up setting up their own things. And we need to think ahead of what they could be already thinking about before we get to that point, if we are going to protect the sustainability of the media. Thank you.
Thank you. Phew. Lots to think about. Lots to think. I'm going to personally, before I open it to the floor, I'm going to pick up on one point that was raised about the vetting of SABC journalists. I think it's an important issue that we need to be thinking about and tackling. There is no good reason to vet journalists at the public broadcaster. Vetting is appropriate where one has access to state secrets. That's what vetting is for. It's, can you be trusted with state secrets? And that's a small amount of people, people like Donald Trump, who you can't trust with state secrets. You certainly couldn't trust him to be an SABC journalist. But there is no good reason to do it in the first place. Never mind the amateurishness with the way it's done over LinkedIn. And the likelihood is, if it's being done, is it's being done to try and test people's loyalty, to put them on edge about their contacts and their private life. It's a very intrusive process, being subjected to those questions. And I think it's something we should tackle, and I think it's something we should encourage the SABC board to tackle on principle, to raise the question of why it's happening at all. Anyway, having said that, let's open it up to any questions or comments. Do I see an indication over there? Reggie, did you indicate? Yes. Can you give him a... Would you introduce yourself?
Thanks a lot, Anton. My name is Reggie Mwalusi. I work for SANEF. I'm just interested in your latter point, Anton, in terms of the vetting of journalists. And I suppose that's even easier with that suggestion because Patiswa is sitting there and she's a journalist herself. And she's sitting on the SABC board at the moment. So I think with what happened prior to the elections with Moshweshwe and all of that, and Patiswa understood the process. And what we know of the SABC at the moment, and new CEO trying to turn it around, but what we shouldn't underestimate is that the SABC is the biggest employer of journalists across this country. So it's an important institution. And we would like to see journalists there being independent, be free to do their work. So I just want to understand, with regard to your suggestion, what is Patiswa's view in terms of that, where the board can take that to the minister, can try to have that removed, that whether you are the executive for news or the editor-in-chief, you shouldn't be vetted.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to respond to that?
It's a conversation that we have not had formally as the board in terms of what the next steps should be. But we have been engaging on the current issue around the vetting of the head of news. I do think that, to the point that Anton was making, that you're not dealing with any state secrets as in that role. And also, if, for instance, one were to say you need to be vetted as head of news, what stops that vetting to filter down to other editors? Because whatever that you're going to know, if let's say you had state secrets that you were dealing with, those would be known by the editors by virtue of the work that you do. So if for the moment we still don't have that filtering down to other editors, if we let it continue, because I understand that there have been attempts to vet regional editors because they are, for instance, head of news in the regions, if one were to put it that way. So it is a problem, but I do think that there is a way that it could be approached, but I do think that the assistance of civil society would be a great deal in that regard to try and address the issue, to the extent that there are more voices who are speaking on it, and it's not just left to the board, because we still have our own issues around the SABC bill itself, in the sense that it gives powers to the minister to appoint the CEO, the COO, and the CFO in the way other state entities are run, that you've got to find concurrence with the minister as the board. Otherwise, if the minister is unhappy, he may not okay that appointment. But the danger is you have a head of news that reports to the CEO. So if you have a CEO that's appointed by the minister, what is the likelihood of independence of the head of news in that arrangement? So there are layers and layers that actually need to be untangled. And which is why I'm saying we need more voices in the public space to raise the issues.
Thank you. I hear you on that. And let me just point out, because I think it needs to be pointed out, that if you're a journalist, an editor-in-chief, and you do get state secrets, your obligation as a journalist is to assess whether it's in the public interest to publish them.
Yeah.
So your professional obligation is, if it's in the public interest, to in fact expose them. And clearly it's the vetting has a chilling effect on willingness and capacity to do that. And that's very worrying because it affects your fundamental professional position.
Absolutely correct, because one of the process that you have to go through, which I found shocking, is that there's a point when the interview or the process is done, they are going to require access to your office without you being there. You don't know what's happening there. So, in fact, I was advised by the person who was the administrative assistant at the time. I was, because they come on site, so the whole thing is done there. And so this lady says to me, I advise you, because we never know what these people do. I advise you that if you have sensitive meetings on editorial matters, take them out of your office.
Sorry, who comes to your office?
It's, as I say, they come to your office, and you have to leave the office because they say they are debugging the office. So you don't know whether they're debugging or actually bugging the office, but that's what happens in the process. So that's how it works. So you're sitting in that office worried about the calls that you are taking, about the advice, the guidance that you are giving to journalists in the newsrooms and sources. It is a problem.
That's
and
extraordinary.
In fact, something that is underestimated as well, because no one really gets to talk about it. And it's something that we picked up. It was on the contracts of employees. Probably your employment contracts, wherever you are, have that clause that the company has a right to monitor your communication. In fact, I would be sitting and working on my desktop, and I would see the cursor moving, and you can tell that someone is reading your emails. That's how it works. And it's a clause that's in your employment contract, and by the time you raise it, it's like, but you signed that you agreed to your processes.
Can I
Go ahead.
I mean, that's a really excellent point, because it's almost a standard employment contract provision for corporates to put this thing in, where they are allowed to monitor employees' email and so on. And corporates tend to use it when you get a whistleblowing report about an employee who might be breaching procurement laws or whatever, and then they monitor and so on. And all of that's legitimate in that context. But it strikes me, as you were saying, that in the media context, there needs to be quite a clear pushback to say that this is completely inappropriate for, and I'm not just talking about the public broadcaster, but any media company who is monitoring for purposes of source or serving a different agenda. I think that is problematic. And I would say on the vetting that I can't see any legal argument that justifies the vetting. And it might be something that SABC board might be empowered by a legal opinion to say, there's no basis for this. That could be used when you're having your discussions with the minister, etc.
So it was interesting that actually the process, the painful retrenchment process that the SABC went through, it enabled me to say the news division staff was not going to sign the new contracts until that clause was removed. The standard one that says you'll be monitored. And we said until that clause is removed, no one is signing the new contracts, and they had to remove it.
That's interesting. Interesting to know that you could take a stand and get it through, so that's good to hear. Any other questions or comments? I've got Karin, and then I've got you, and then I've got you. Let's, sorry, Karin first, and I'll come to you.
Thanks, Anton. Karin du Plessis, I'm a journalist for the Africa Report. Patricia, I have a question. I've listened to, I've done a few sort of courses or, had lectures on how to safeguard your communications and everything. And I would think it's easier to just bug your, or, to listen in on your phone. I mean, doesn't the SSA have more sophisticated ways than to actually go into the office and pretend to bug it? If they want to actually, listen in on your communications, it kind of worries me in a way as well, because, what are our law enforcement capacities when it comes to cybersecurity? So that's kind of the flip side of it. But yeah, it's really worrying to hear that. And then the other question, the secrecy bill, I read somewhere that there was a attempt to revive it, but I haven't actually sort of really kept up with it. Maybe, I don't know if Dario's nodding.
If I can just respond to you before coming to the next person, because we'll take a few questions. On why they would be so crude as to come to your office and pretend to debug. I think it's clear, because they want you to know they're watching you. They want to be seen to do it. If they want to discreetly listen to your calls, they have ways to do that. So it's to provoke, it's to create that chilling effect. And secondly, maybe you can add to this or correct me, but my understanding is that the secrecy bill was sent back by the president some years back. He declined to sign it, he sent it back to Parliament. So the current Parliament has now got this waiting there, and they have to do something with it. You might recall the old Official Secrets Act did need replacing, and so they have to do something. So they start with the secrecy bill as it was sent back. It does mean that it reopens all the discussions. The one they're looking at, if I remember correctly, is significantly better than the earlier versions, but it still has problems.
That's absolutely right. I mean, where it's left off is that there was some concession to a form of a public interest defense, which is the big issue, for me anyway. The idea that, as Anton was saying, it's an ethical responsibility of a journalist to publish even classified information if it is in the public interest. One thinks of, obviously, the clear examples, Nkandla, Homestead, and on the global context, the Pentagon Papers. But you could, just as Julian Assange was, be prosecuted if you do so under the current Protection of Information Act 82, which needs replacing, absolutely. The last version of the secrecy bill was far more balanced after lots of media and civil society engagement. But it only, as I recall, it said, if you reveal criminal activity through your publication, you can publish. But that's too limited a form of a public interest sort of defense. So it needs to go further. And it will be probably on the new Parliament's agenda, I'm sure, in due course. So we should all be quite vigilant to follow that.
Go ahead. Would you give her a mic?
I'm Janet Smith, and I'm a former editor and journalist and a writer, and I'm now an adjudicator at the Press Council. Dr. Mohammed, I wanted to say thank you so much. What a surprise to hear all of this important research and these thoughts around arts and culture. And where you intersected with arts and culture journalism, I think those of my colleagues in the room here who, those of us who've been around for a long time will know that I started out in arts and culture journalism. And I also wanted to commend you for mentioning Charles Blino, a very good friend of mine, an excellent journalist. There is a reason why we don't have arts and culture journalism today, and that is precisely because of that crushing of interrogation of anything around what the Department of Arts and Culture is doing, what is happening around funding. And so it's been reduced to covering celebrities and entertainment. Nothing wrong with that at all. But the actual, I guess, the investigation of what is arts and culture in South Africa, how does it happen, that journalism is dead. And it's a great, great pity. And I also commend Anton for having you on the board of the CFE, because if we don't have an interest from both areas, arts and culture, journalism, and so on, and work together, because in the end we are kindred spirits, we're lost. So just to say thank you for that.
Thank you, Janet. There was no question there, but there was a useful comment. Next in line was, sorry, it's this person here and then you. It's Odwe?
Hi.
Sorry, first is, and you're next.
She's giving me. She says I must speak.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Edward Sumelo. I'm the editor of City Life Arts. We do arts and culture there. We write arts and culture, just to let you know. But what I'm interested in the issue of sustainability, and I think it's quite important. You spoke earlier on about the big tech and why it's problematic. But I want to know, you also referred to some model that is emerging elsewhere in terms of big tech contribution to journalism. I just want to know which countries are those, and also the inquiry that you spoke about, which I suppose is just happened in this country. When is that report coming out? Thank you.
I can help with an answer there if you wish. But do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. My name is Uyanda from SOS Coalition. I am interested in asking you a question, Patsisa. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about having the editor, having the head of news be the editor-in-chief, and the fact that it's actually going to leave editorial decisions that are within programming exposed. And I'm just keen to actually understand how those editorial decisions are currently being made where programming is concerned. Is it centralized? Is it within the video entertainment, GE? And if not, you also spoke about a mechanism. What mechanism are you proposing and putting forward? Are you suggesting that those powers are then taken back and given back to the CEO? Do you think that the CEO would be a much better person? Because I think this is something that we argue against in our analysis of the bill, and we're saying, the CEO is someone that understands the business, but they don't understand any, editorial decision making. So, I'm really keen to hear what proposal you're putting forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that first?
Thank you, Yanda, for that question. I think for me, okay, starting with currently, it's sitting all over the place. Video entertainment, TV is doing its own thing, radio is doing its own thing, and which is why you see we saw the canning of the interview of the Jewish survivor on Metro FM, because producers make their own decisions, and there's no one who actually is there as an upward referral for that space being programming that's outside news. So you can imagine the uncoordinated way that decisions that are being made, and it doesn't help the fact that you then end up with content that necessarily doesn't serve the public broadcasting mandate of the SABC, because no one is championing that in the spaces that are outside news. But I do think that if you were to think of a mechanism that is going to address that, it wouldn't go back to the CEO still, because you still want to accommodate, not just accommodate, but address the issues of freedom of expression where artistic content is produced as part of entertainment. So you need to leave that protected still. So I wouldn't take that to the CEO, but I do think that there is a need for a centralized, a central point where producers can go and say, I have this issue that I'm dealing with. How would you provide me counsel in terms of resolving it? Currently, it doesn't exist.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. Edward, I'll give you a brief answer and can add to it if you wish, but it's too big an area to go into in great depth now. But there are countries, in Australia, the government forced Google to get into negotiations with publishers in order to pay for the use of their content. But that agreement is coming to an end, and it's basically falling apart. So it's a model that worked for, I think, 3 years, but is unlikely to continue. I mean, one of the things that happens is that these platforms take the view very often that if news is too troublesome for them, they'll just drop it. They threaten that, and they have carried it out in places like Canada, I believe, as a threat to an attempt to get them to pay for the use of that news. But it's certainly a common belief, and certainly my belief, that news is extremely important to them, and the research backs that up. So it's a threat they make and sometimes implement, but it's not one they're likely to really stick with. So there are a few countries that have made them platforms like Google pay and negotiate with publishers to pay for the use of their news, and there are places where they have set up funds. In South Africa, we have a competition commission hearing taking place, and their initial report is expected out in October, I believe. So it's due. And that will be extremely important in what it recommends as the way forward in dealing with the fact that our news is used by these global platforms without any compensation, and that it's wrecking our local news industry. They did, in private discussions with publishers, make an offer to set up a fund. They were kind of secret discussions. Everything with these platforms is secret. That's absolutely true. But the amounts they offered were rejected. They weren't serious amounts to compensate for the cost of collecting and producing that news. And there are ongoing discussions about setting up a sustainability fund, of which at least one platform has said they may contribute. I know Reggie Sarnef is involved in the discussion about setting up such a fund, and there are other discussions around that. So it's an ongoing issue and discussion, but you are right that the impact these platforms are having on our news industry is a devastating one, and it's one we need to face up and address if our local media industry is to survive. Do you want to add anything? No? I've got an indication there, yes?
So doesn't news cease to be news? As soon as it's published, it's no longer news. However, there are artistic and other professional aspects that come in together with that particular news item. So I would have said that anybody whatsoever can always repeat the news that has been published in the gist of it, but should be prevented from replaying the whole rigmarole as perhaps may be done by some institutions.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, I think that I'd agree with that. Obviously there's the two-pronged attack against the platforms at the moment, largely in South Africa and many other countries. The one is the competition angle, insofar as the market for advertising is concerned, right? Because the idea there is that the argument is that because of their dominance, advertisers, they're able to corner the advertising market and in so doing undermine, legacy media's ability to do that. The second is copyright, insofar as you say, when you put snippets, say on Google, of my news story, sometimes that's enough for transient recipients of news to say, well, I actually know now the gist of the story. I don't have to click through and find out, the full story. And that phenomenon, I think arguably breaches copyright, where you use the snippets from the story or the headline of the story. So there are various sort of strategies to try and bring the platforms to account. And Anton says, there are kind of discussions in parallel and so on. But this competition report, which is imminent, is really going to, I think, play an incredibly important role in informing the debate going forward.
If I can just add to what you're saying, you have to see it in the context of the fact that they're scooping up all the ad revenue. So I spend a huge amount of money producing news and publishing my news. Yes, it's out there. It's out there in the open. But then a platform like Google or Facebook takes that, pays nothing, and uses it to take your revenue and make money from it without compensating you. So that you have to build into the equation to understand it's having a huge impact on our industry. How do we manage that impact in a reasonable way?
And just in addition to that, it's easy to try and deal with the issue as it stands now because we have a visible enemy and we can say so and so is using our content. What is happening with AI? You have all these AI tools that are all over the place. Everybody has come up with, we knew that it was GPT at one point. You have Gemini, you have all of them that are in place now. And they're actually using the same content that we produce as a database for whatever questions that I want to ask. And in fact, in the future, we are likely to have news media. In fact, we're starting to see it. There is what I believe to be, it's the South African, and there's another platform, and there's another one, but they literally piggyback on what has been published already. And all you need, if you were to do that, you get an AI software and you say, I want to tell a story about the state of media freedom in South Africa in 2024. You publish an article. You have not done any research. It's media content that is giving you that. And you don't know how to hold those people accountable because they are not Google, they are not Facebook, they are not the visible enemies that we know. It's someone who's lying on his back in his room, a student who's set up yeah. So how are you going to deal with that?
No, these are real problems. And Alan, I've neglected you. Do you have anything you want to add to what's been said?
No, I don't actually. I've been finding the conversation fascinating. It just shows how, as much as we've tried to represent what's going on in different sectors, it's so much going on. I mean, Ishmael's stories, Mario's more detailed stories, Fatiswa's examples and that. So we do our best is my feeling, but
Thank you.
we always fall short, and we doomed to.
Thank you. Juliana, introduce yourself.
Hopefully, Juliana Thornton. I do some work with Media Monitoring Africa and also with Anton. So my question is, whose job is it to have this conversation with Google and big tech around the kind of imposing regulations on them? There's obviously the advocacy role that MMA plays, that CFE plays, but it's not really in government's best interests to inject more funding and more money into independent media unless they can kind of control where that money goes, perhaps. If they say, okay, well, only give the money to SABC or whatever. So how do you deal with that, and whose job is it to really push government to make those agreements and to regulate the big tech? I don't know if there's an answer, but I'm just putting it out there.
But I'll respond. I mean, the body that's taken it on in this country is the Competition Commission. And actually, that's an interesting place for it to happen because there are deep issues there about the dominance of, for example, the Google platform or of Facebook. And the dominance of them in our advertising revenues. So it is an interesting place for the discussion to happen.
And that is in fact what triggered the solutions in Australia, was also a similar competition inquiry, which then sort of in quite intrusive and in comprehensive form sets out, having listened to evidence and testimony, and we saw all of that with the media companies here and Meta and Facebook, Meta and Google, but sort of the conspicuous by their absence, for example, Elon Musk's X. Once the Competition Commission has sifted through all of that, and they do that very professionally and extremely competently, you will get a very persuasive document, hopefully in the next few weeks, if not days. I don't know if there's been a delay, but certainly they did promise it in October. And that will set the stage, I think, because what the Competition Commission, for example, could do is they could recommend that legislation be passed. And that might then be taken up by Parliament. So it's a really important part of the piece in trying to hold platforms to account.
And of course, it's a fascinating time because in America, the home of Google, there is a court looking at the possibility of forcing a breakup of Google. So that decision is absolutely critical to our own media industry, interestingly, and we'll watch that closely. Our time has run out. I think I'm going to wrap up. I hope you have found this conversation as rich and interesting as I have. It has certainly illuminated need ongoing vigilance. So thank you very much to a very interesting panel. And may this discussion continue. Perhaps we should highlight that the next session today, do you want to do that?
Good morning, everyone. And I think another round of applause to the panel. What a fantastic session to kick off Media Freedom Festival. Just to highlight the rest of the sessions for the day, at 2 o'clock, we'll be having a more intimate conversation, which will be taking place in the library just across the courtyard. And there we're looking at incitement online. A really heated topic, heated debate, what the sort of boundaries and parameters are when talking about incitement to violence online. It's a sort of one-on-one conversation, but we'll be tackling it from a technical perspective as well. So those of you who are more interested in the more nerdy, geeky side of things, it's the perfect conversation. And then this evening at 6 p.m., we'll be looking at building global solidarity with media freedom, and there we'll be looking at Media Freedom Coalition, the Global Media Freedom Coalition. So also said to be a really engaging and interesting discussion. So once again, thank you to the session this morning. Yes, you can please go ahead. Thank you. And we hope to see you at some of the other sessions, not only today, tomorrow and Thursday as well. You'll have access to the programs online, but please enjoy the rest of the day. There are refreshments outside, so please don't run away too quickly. All right, thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. So I've been advised that refreshments will be ready after 10 minutes, so please stay with us. We don't want you to leave without having taken something. So 10 minutes.
Mali para yoro la mogolo manka. Jamake yoro la mogolo manka. Jamako, Jamako, Jamako. Jamako, Jamako, Jamako. Jamako, Jamako, Jamako. Jamako, Jamako, Jamako. Jalondo kasoro jalonte ni de mango oyara duba kono uba fofana to kasoro fanante ni de mango oyara duba kono uba fo yatime kasoro yatimante kana baga walide ma ama vengila kana baga falato ma ama ni kana paga yatime ma ama vengila ni kana paga falato ma ama vengila son 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 baba deni welela saramani lambe mama lonta jarani sati geni welela wasalo kone sera koloni di luma koloni di ka fo kunte mui kone sera bera la luma bera la ka fo kunte mui kone sera kala tabori luma kala tabori ka fo kunte mui sengoni ngamui kunte mui kimbolo koni ngamui kunte mui nindugu kolo ngamui kunte mui nikwaburu ngamui kunte mui kone sigile alama kono lela alama kono joni sigite nyani ko sigite mozo fimini tama ko yala e mo bela korolo kono kelenga ma woro nyakili wolo fila kono ni kelenta keleta gola kono ndori fente do bolo fento terike bolo siri tanga madia mamuta madia mani jamana de kanyera iya umuga mora dauda bu kamora iya umuga mora bamako kamora ipo iya umuga mora azolo kamora rusini jula mini tekeleni togo jammi che jamba fana manga kone wata ikume dolon tono ya jaga mali jarabi dolon ta falango jaga ne malonta sate iya iya ni folina fo mali de mie Afo alhamdulillahi arabla lamina kanu masaya layemba alhamdulillahi arabla lamina kikata no bilamari minidamba musodo be dunuya te konomba musoni me kono ya tanwolo musodo be dunuya te kono muso be denga kele soro denga kele ngafuza denga tando emba Teganinjeli tunana saramani lambe mama lonta jeli taninjeli tunana wasulu konese amasa bara kakan so fendola ala bolezi kaboni deni kasabari lokanye jeli talamba koneno yesabali tala kona folote mara fimini sabari koneno yesabali tala adudu mante kela fimini sabari koneno
nimbetini kelu ko dunya balutari orombo faluye mo faluye ni kamenebi koke bafina mi ngoya musole ya fudu muso. Avionada ni kwenye kariale kasanseni ya luro kelu kamuna ke dunyaro kamomini kururu lada momini lada ni kwenye kariale kasanseni ya luro kelu kamuna ke dunyaro kamansini kururu lada katerembalu ni mansini wolu lada kukanumbodo ni taro wositembe na kela mokoya ni musotaro. Naluyeni na korosila kokele mabi molu koni make aduteke kamusoke alimamini umake kono musole alimaminu soruna nyekumani fola kebalu kebalu nyekumani fola kasinka kumani faluye Sanani kanima, dudani kanima, alaka feme fila fila leda komisali. Kasani duguda, kasuni teleda, kakeni musoda, kanambe mara maso musola, kono kusite penani musote. Warombo faluye, bo faluye. Nabi numa meni sorona, sayma meni soroni, wali ju meni soroni, waluma tulo musola, angana tulo musola. Mama ya, nyemo ya kuntiya, woteli la mugoma ni musoti, angana tulo musola.
Banyeba o banyeba, banyeba bara musonyeba, banyeba o banyeba, banyeba yo henyeba, banyeba li banyeba, bara musonyeba. Anyuele ngonye buzu dumwele mukana, banyeba bara musonyeba, anyuele ngonye bamanande umwele mukana, banyeba yo henyeba, iye nganyuele
manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mana mi foti mi senunye ndiya nyabo faunyana mana mi fonda nyamaluye demi sembo faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana demi sembo faunyana nebe dowere faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana mana mi foti mi senunye ndiya nyabo faunyana mana mi fondi anyamaluye demi sembo faunyana mbali manyu manu yo nebe nani ne faunyana demi sembo faunyana anabai bonde anabai bonde boy anabai bonde anabai bonde anabai bonde.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you are outside, I'm just going to invite you to start making your way into the room so we can take a seat. We're going to start the program in about 11 minutes. That's going to be at 6:15. So if you need to grab a drink or a quick bite, you've got about 11 minutes to do so, and then we'll get going in the next 11 minutes, okay?
Kano mandenye shiri sukorasa shiri sukorasa sufeta janna shiri jarabi sukorasa shiri sukorasa na 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 jarabi sukorasa Jarabi sukorasa Kanu 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 kadinye shiri sukorasa Ula jana kanu kadinye jarabi sukorasa Jana kano kadinye ami sukorasa Jarabi sukorasa
jana kanu mandinye yarabi sukurasa Shiri sukurasa Jana kanu kadinye jarabi sukurasa Mana miri jemani amima sukurasa Jarabi shiri sukurasa Jarabi
Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. We're starting in just under 5 minutes, so if you could please start making your way into the room, and we're about to kickstart in 5 minutes, okay? Will our panelists also make their way to the front as well? Thank you. Can we start? Are we done? All right, so let's settle down, everyone. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I know that it's really difficult to make plans to join a festival or a panel discussion when we're in the middle of the week. We all have very busy lives and massive commitments. So we really appreciate you being here for this really important discussion. And it is, of course, the Media Freedom Festival. And I think now more
Recording
than
in
ever, with the
progress.
state of geopolitics, this discussion becomes so important as we are obviously faced by a world that is becoming more and more polarized, right? Even the stories that we tell as journalists becoming so much more polarized. And so now more than ever, it's important for us to have a discussion around just what it means for media to be free, not just in Africa, but now in other parts of the world. And what is the solidarity that that needs to look like from a global point of view? But I want to start a little bit with what the importance of media freedom actually is to a journalist on a daily basis. How many of us here are active journalists in the field? If you'd put your hands up for me. Okay. For those of us that are journalists, you'd know that it is not the most fun job, right? We don't have the luxury of telling the good news stories, although we've been asked to quite a few times here in South Africa to focus more on the positive stories. But we don't have that luxury, right? We, on a daily basis, are faced with the most horrific realities of our country, of what's happening in the world. I was quite glad when I saw that on the program tomorrow afternoon there's a big discussion around mental health for journalists, and I think it is incredibly important that that conversation takes place because journalists never sleep. They're never off duty. They're always watching what's happening. And the expectations for journalists are massive. You can't maybe have the story right. You need to have that story straight. And that's a pressure that you live with on a daily basis. It is a massive and exhausting responsibility, mentally and otherwise. Now imagine living with that reality on a daily basis, and then as you do your job, you're faced by the intimidation. Someone sees a story that you've written and goes out on Twitter, for instance, and threatens to rape you and kill your entire family just because they don't like how you've written that story. That's the reality for many journalists in South Africa. The reality for many journalists in South Africa as well, not too many, but some we've seen, is some of them facing even physical intimidation and violence as they do their jobs. But I want to remind you of one story that scared the living daylights out of me. This is in 2018. If you're a journalist and you imagine, working, for instance, in the Middle East, I remember covering the story of Jamal Khashoggi. And that was one of the more difficult stories to cover. Because you think about how, on a daily basis, you're just doing your job. But one day, you may very well disappear for doing that job. Because somebody doesn't like you. And then not only that, your family will never even be able to find solace because the answers for Khashoggi's family still have not come. And the examples that we'll look at today are many, unfortunately. And then as we see growing tension on a geopolitical level, those stories are escalated over and over again. But what is the responsibility of a country like ours? One thing we can agree on about South Africa is it's certainly shown how brave it is this particular year, right? Going all the way to the ICJ to speak out around the war in Gaza and calling it a genocide. The responses to it, of course, have been very polarized, no surprises there. But South Africa's taken a position, and that position is solidarity. But what responsibility then do we have to show for solidarity for media freedom, to allow journalists to be able to focus on the pressures of getting the job right and not just the pressures of actually staying alive as well? So we're going to be having I hope, a heated discussion. I hope a healthy discussion. I hope a respectful discussion as well over the next hour and a half. We'll hear from the German Embassy's head of politics. We also are going to be joined virtually by the Deputy Minister in the Presidency, Mr. Kenneth Morolong. We are joined as well by Mr. Sbu Ngalwa on stage. He, of course, is chairperson of SANEF and Treasurer General of the African Editors Forum, and William Bird, who is Director of Media Monitoring Africa. Can we start with this? Please give them a warm round of applause for making the time. Right, and the Deputy Minister's joined us, but I'm going to welcome onto the stage now Ms. Bianca Dormuth, who's the Head of Politics for the German Embassy, to open things up.
Thank you, thank you. I will put this a bit higher. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. Thank you for this introduction. I think you set the tone for tonight, what it's about, what it really means. But first, Deputy Minister is there. Yeah, he's there. Okay, good evening. William Bird, Sbu Ngalwa, thank you for being here, for discussing with us. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Media Freedom Festival and to this first evening event. We are, I'm sure you are aware of this, celebrating 5 years of the Media Freedom Coalition with this festival. And building global solidarity is the topic of this festival. You have mentioned it already. You also introduced me, thank you for that. I'm from the German Embassy. Germany is now the co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, and I will explain to you later a bit what this means and also what our priorities are. Media freedom and the safety and freedom of journalists are the oxygen in a democracy. Our freedom and our democracies depend on the safety and on the freedom of the media and those who work in our media. So this we should never forget. You know, media freedom for some sounds abstract, but it concerns all of us. It concerns not only journalists, not only people who work for media in a broader sense, but it connects to each one of us. So this is also one aspect of solidarity. We are all concerned when journalists are being imprisoned, put under pressure, restricted in their work due to censorship or, you know, by like harassment online or offline, physical or mental harassment. But we also see a great problem increasingly in mis- and disinformation. So I think our discussion should also tackle that, if you like, because journalists are vital for a democracy because they are the ones who can give people the basis for an informed decision. Like, you journalists are the ones who present facts, who check facts, who present both sides of a case, and not only, you know, a polemic stance for one side, but you are the ones who enable people to take a decision, to inform themselves, to understand what is happening. So, as you said, this puts a lot of pressure on journalists, and on top comes the pressure that we don't want. The professional pressure is one thing, but journalists shouldn't feel pressured by physical harassment, by online threats. Some are killed, some are, many are in prison, currently 547 journalists. So we need to protect journalists. We need to protect media freedom. And this is the idea behind this coalition. It was founded 5 years ago in 2019. And of course, you can ask yourself the question, if you look at all the initiatives around the world, what do we need another coalition for? There's so many, nice initiatives with, nice names, and nobody knows what they're really doing. So let me explain to you what the idea is and why this Media Freedom Coalition is so important. It unites 51 countries from 6 continents. The idea is to really bring together a global initiative, to not just have it, centered, let's say, in Europe or, in one region of the world, but really see it's a global issue. We need media freedom because without media freedom, human rights go down, liberties go down. So it is an issue for all the world. It is a very broad coalition, and not just, the small usual group of like-minded. We still want to broaden the coalition, so our aim is to get this, make it even larger coalition. I said 51 countries now, we are hoping for more. But another aspect is maybe even more interesting. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative, and this is quite unique. So if you look at media freedom, the addressee is the government. The government has to guarantee it. And in many cases, the government is the one who limits with censorship or restrictive laws or imprisonment the freedom of journalists. So the government is also the one being, watched closely by NGOs and being criticized by NGOs, but in many cases, the NGOs don't have the access to the government. So they can, publish something or protest or whatever. And so we try to, bring them together, to have in the Media Freedom Coalition the countries, the governments, and the NGOs, and legal experts and multinational organizations. So everyone who, from a different perspective, deals with media freedom comes together, and of course the journalists. There's a consultative network of NGOs consisting of 22 NGOs. So this is a quite unique, of course, NGOs will be, with the UN, for example, on various formats, but this is quite unique, and we hope that this really helps to be creative, to be flexible, and to really make a difference. It's also a very flexible structure, so it makes it easy for countries to join. There is no big, barrier. It should be easy to join to really advance the cause, because this is what it's about. So what we are aiming for is a still stronger collaboration between the civil society and the governments. And this is why I'm so grateful you're here. I want to be brief because I'm looking forward to your questions, to our discussion, to also what you will say. But let me conclude with a big thank you to the Presidency of South Africa, the Government Communication and Information System, Media Monitoring Africa, of course, and all the organizing partners. A special thank you to Monchato. Where is she? Ah, yes, because she's leaving the organization after the Media Freedom Festival, I heard. Thank you so much for many, many years of trustful cooperation. We will miss you. I also would like to thank the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, the Campaign for Free Expression, the Association of Independent Publishers, the Press Council of South Africa, the SOS Coalition, and of course our hosts tonight, the Goethe Institute. So please feel free to later ask or raise any topics that are important to you, and thank you for being here tonight.
All right, so we're going to get going, but I just wanted to let you know we're going to have a very brief panel discussion. Then what we'll do is we'll take questions towards the end, and let's make it energetic. Let's make it lively. Let's leave here having achieved something and not another talk shop. How many talk shops have you been to? Then you come out and you think, well, we've heard that conversation before, right? Let's try and move the needle if we can today. I want to just give the microphone, if you will, to Mr. Kenneth Morolong, who is the Deputy Minister in the Presidency, who joins us virtually. And I'm going to actually start off with a question for you, DM. And it's the question I'll also hand over to our panelists, but you can have the first bite of it. And that question is, from a government point of view, where do you place how South Africa is contributing to the discussion of solidarity to global media freedom? DM, good evening and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. We wish to convey our greetings to the members of the Fourth Estate. We are delighted by the opportunity to engage with you on this important day, which is quite a historic day in many respects. In the first instance, in the sense that this was a day which was used by the then apartheid government and the former Minister of Justice to clamp down on media houses which were seen to have been reporting on the atrocities that were suffered by our people under the apartheid regime. When the South African government went to ICJ, it did so mindful of the fact that there were atrocities which were meted out against women, against the innocent Palestinian children, but also against journalists. And so this was a clarion call for the world to reject the abuse and attack on the Palestinian people, but also on the journalists. And these are but many other efforts. You know that South Africa guarantees the right to press freedom. It is a hard-won right, and we have created institutions to make sure that that right is not abused. And so we think that we will continue to join many other voices throughout the world to speak against the attack of journalists who are hard at work in exposing the atrocities suffered by the peoples of the world. And so this is the commitment we are making today.
All right, DM. DM, thank you so much for that. Is everyone able to hear me? How's that? Okay. DM, thank you so much for that opening remark. Mr. Ngalu, I'm going to let you take the microphone next, right? And that question is around solidarity to global media freedom. Now, you've got the benefit of actually doing some of this work, not just here in South Africa with SANEF, but also from a continental point of view. And I know that as part of the coalition, they've already got 3 African countries that are part of the Media Freedom Coalition, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, Botswana, Ghana, and Sierra Leone as well. But I suppose there's something to be said about even when we talk about media freedom on the continent, we certainly like to use that broad brush, right, and say, oh, media freedom on the continent isn't where it should be. But you need to look at the pockets of where it's really bad and the pockets of where it is actually looking really good. Burundi, for instance, a horrible example of what media freedom can look like when journalists are completely stifled. But lessons on solidarity to global media freedom on the continent.
Thank you, Naledi. Good evening. It's lovely to see a number of familiar faces here. I think I'll start by indicating that in July, actually, SANEF went through a successful AGM where new leadership was elected. I now sit as the Treasurer General of SANEF.
Looking after the monies.
Exactly. Which is a corresponding role that I also play in the African Editors Forum. Now, South Africa has a Bill of Rights which guarantees everyone's freedom, right? Freedom to dignity, freedom to life. And I think that's why for us as the media in this country, and particularly as SANEF, I mean, our motto is that it's about South Africa, because we understand that we are guided by this very constitution. And I think that South Africa's approach to issues of human rights and media freedom, we actually have a very good constitution. That is our compass. That should help us, guide us. And in every environment and in every case, we should always be driven by those fundamental principles that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. I think the important thing for all of us to understand, and I think this point was made very strongly when we celebrated World Press Freedom Day by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. We actually said that media freedom is not optional. You know, without the media, there is no freedom. And we are seeing that in a number of areas. And I think that as we sit here today, we sit here just a few days after the Committee to Protect Journalists issued a report on the Middle East about the killing of journalists and the targeting of journalists by Israel. And we, as the South African National Editors Forum, have been quite vociferous in actually pledging solidarity with the journalists in Israel, rather in Gaza, because we believe that the situation is, we all know that the situation is unprecedented. And the fact that you have so many journalists being killed and the impunity, with such impunity, and everyone turning a blind eye, that actually is a dangerous, it sets a dangerous precedent for every part of the world. As you would know that the global West generally has taken that position where they have been, to many countries, a model of what I guess civilization ought to be. But the reality is that the position on the Middle East and how they're actually turning a blind eye is dangerous for all of us. Because if Israel can get away with killing over 120 media workers, and they get away with it, how much more for a Burkina Faso? Who should care? Why should anybody do anything about it? Who will say anything? If the multilateral order through the United Nations, if we ignore such, what does that then mean? Why should anybody care when the ICC summons anyone, right? So we are already seeing regression in some areas. I mean, we know that in West Africa, there was the coups that gave rise to the Sahel states. And in those countries, actually, we have colleagues who have disappeared over the past few months. We have colleagues who have gone into exile because there's the old playbook that dictators, or well, I guess benevolent dictators, as they would want to be seen, that they play where it's an us and them. It's either you're with the people or you're against the people. So we have a situation where journalists are projected as either they are for the government or they are agents of the West. So what this then does is that you are also seeing this in countries like Ghana. A colleague of mine was speaking at the Africa Check Awards in Ghana. And he made the point about how there have been cases in Ghana of media suppression. And also there's just recently in Nigeria, there was a story of sports reporters being abducted, right? And we're coming from an election in Kenya where the military and the police were directly targeting journalists. So what then this says is that it may not be us today. We may sit here and marvel at the fact that we've got this great constitution and we've got these freedoms that are directed, these freedoms that are guaranteed in the constitution. We have a strong judiciary. But the reality is that once you have such behavior and such an unprecedented attack and killing of journalists in Gaza, it then means that nobody should care. Museveni can do as he pleases. Traore can do as he pleases. Kagame can do as he pleases. Anybody else can do as they please because there are no rules, basically. So I think that's the fundamental issue that we're grappling with here. And I think that the coalition actually did issue a statement, I think in May, when the yes, actually, when the Israeli law which is so-called Al Jazeera law was enacted.
Yes, there was another one just recently in September. Yes.
Yes.
And it has been part of resolutions issued for like Women's Day and other days, where the situation of journalists in conflicts was addressed, for special days. So not only for specific resolutions, but in general ones as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So also you've got about 50 countries, right, who are part of the coalition. And I believe that there should be more countries who are part of this coalition, because the more you have global solidarity for the media, the better. But I think that this should actually it would be not be seen. It would be hypocritical of us to just think that because we've got a coalition, therefore that then means everything is fine. I guess that the host countries as well, these very countries, should put their money where their mouth. Or is it the mouth?
Money where your mouth is. Yes.
That's it. Bad expression. When it comes to issues of media freedom, and not be selective about it. Every life matters. Thank you.
Yeah, a really good point. Thank you. Please give them a warm round of applause. Or him. Yeah. William, if you've heard William speak on any media platform, you know that he really doesn't hold back in criticizing, particularly the South African media landscape. And I think that such an important voice. And then there's the question that Sbu, you've talked about how, I suppose, fortunate journalists here are in South Africa, right? We were looking at the Media Freedom Index, and I was looking at the data there. No journalists killed in South Africa in the past year, thank goodness for that. But that doesn't necessarily make us touch wood, right? That doesn't necessarily make us the gold standard for media freedom, and I think that maybe you can talk to us about that, right? Where we rate media freedom in South Africa, and then the voice that we need to raise from the global solidarity point of view, because that's essentially where we're driving the conversation. But where do you rate where we are as a country, and if we're having the right conversations? Sbu talked about this idea of the us and them, and perhaps later on we'll ask the Deputy Minister as well around how he views, what they call, patriotic journalism versus fact-finding journalism, right? But talk to us. What is your rating?
So I think the MFC offers us a wonderful opportunity to show that thing of two opposite things can be true at the same time. Where the Media Freedom Coalition is a marvelous idea, it's great, and at the same time it can be a complete failure and a disaster if there's no meaningful action behind it, and if the Media Freedom Coalition isn't represented overwhelmingly in future by the Global South. Because until and unless that happens, all the kind of anti-rights discourse and all of those sorts of things are going to continue to emerge and actually progressively take over. On a number of obvious levels, we've got a massively high level of solidarity and media freedom. The fact that we're doing this, all of us together, that we're sitting in a room with all of these partners together, that we can engage robustly with our ministers, with our presidency. People can walk out and say anything they like about the president, and then they don't need to fear that they're going to be arrested or put in jail. Yeah. At the same time, however, there are, of course, very, very real and increasingly real risks for journalists being able to do their job. One, the basic model that they have, fewer and fewer journalists are able to be employed. This is one of the biggest risks identified by the Press Freedom Index of threats to freedom of expression in South Africa, right? That idea of news as a public good, the importance, incredible importance of information integrity, the importance of the public broadcaster, all of these things teetering on the verge of collapse day-to-day basis, and that undermines all of the kind of good work that's there. And it's a bit like the MFC, right? In principle, it's a lovely idea, but it has to be backed by meaningful action. We've got, a poster showing 175 lives that have been lost in a year, which is an astonishing thing, and it's like, until and unless there's action and there's consequence for this, and states can't just say we support media freedom. There has to be meaningful action around how they support media freedom. In South Africa, there's a lot of concern, and correctly so in most respects, about the state of whistleblowers being attacked and the consequence for doing their actions. And journalists are frequently the ones that are doing this, and yet we don't then see the concomitant kind of protection and stressing the importance of the role that journalism plays in our society. So yes, we've got a brilliant constitution, still probably one of the best in the world. And we've got a government that, you know, thanks to civil society and efforts by them and the media, haven't been able to, where there have been unfortunate efforts to, you know, undermine freedom of expression, it hasn't happened. So we've got that high level of solidarity, but we need, for this global thing to take off, we need it to be supported by meaningful action, and we need it to be supported by real voices from the global south.
Yeah. Deputy Minister, I'm going to bring you back in here because I think that all of us are curious as to what happens in the Office of the Presidency, for instance, when a story comes out and the conversations that take place when, you know, a story comes out around what's happening in government. What does it look like? And I ask that question because obviously we touched on this earlier. What is pro-South Africa journalism and what is anti? What is fact-telling and what is what we call patriotic journalism? Is there a conversation in the presidency around needing to improve media freedom, or is it, and let's be honest here, particularly, you know, William just talked about the resources, for instance, that are allocated to, say, the SABC, for instance, the public broadcaster, he says, he used the words, teetering on the brink of collapse. Again, DM, his words. But what's the conversation around the importance of creating a healthy landscape in South Africa, so that even if we do join the coalition, we're good examples to other countries on the continent and abroad. So what is the position of government where that's concerned? Where's the resources going to come in so that we're able to create that landscape? And is there a sense that, you know, there is an us and them, a pro-government media or an anti-government media, DM?
Well, I don't think that sentiment has been expressed by government in its you know, official and documented messaging. I don't think so. We, however, would obviously look at the journalists as men and women who are ethical in the execution of their responsibilities. We would be perturbed as government by the proliferation of fake news, which continues to be a threat to our thriving democracy. We, however, believe that you know, journalists must be global patriots who promote global peace, who promote equitable world order, who are committed to fair reporting, and that is why I earlier said that we have you know, put institutions in place so that in the event that this reporting is not balanced, it's not fair, it's inaccurate, there must be recourse for those who are aggrieved by the reports. But the government enjoys a very healthy relationship with the media, and we will continue to strengthen that link because media is a lifeblood of any democracy, and for it to thrive, there must be freedom of press, and the government must be seen to be promoting that freedom of press.
Okay, I want to look at a few themes at the moment, and the sort of discussions that perhaps are hot topics, difficult discussions to have in this time, in this era. And Mr. Ngalo, I'm going to bring this one to you first, because, or maybe William, I'll let you have it, because then Smoo can respond to some of the ideas put forward here. We're having a discussion just outside, actually, with some of the ladies that are here to talk about just the impact of climate change on any other, you know, second week on the news. We're reporting about some horrible weather event somewhere in the world, and sometimes it's just down the road, right? Sometimes it's just here in KZN. Goodness knows what else is coming up in KZN. And then we've got to ask, is it weather or climate? Which one is it? But it's a constant question. But it seems that even climate is becoming
It's
a difficult...
MK Rising.
Is that what it is in KZN? But it seems that even the climate change discussion is a difficult one for journalists. Because you still have those that don't believe it's real. There's those that, I mean, here in South Africa, for instance, you mentioned climate change in Africa. Don't be surprised if you cover a story and someone on Twitter comes out or shouts it in your face that, well, South Africa or Africa contributes 4% to global emissions, so don't talk to us about that. So when you talk about climate change, it gets into energy, and you don't want us to industrialize. Woo, it's a difficult touch. It's a touchy discussion. But can we talk a little bit about how difficult that conversation is in South Africa, William? And also lessons that we're learning about how tough climate change discussions are globally.
I mean, you just look at an activist like Greta Thunberg, right? Yeah. Who is routinely doxxed and harassed and threatened for being an activist about climate change. I mean, Elon Musk and Donald Trump have had a go at her because they don't like what she says. And it's the same thing all around the world, right? Journalists speak out, women journalists in particular, a woman with an opinion, basically on social media, will be doxxed, harassed, and threatened. So the environment for journalists. And then when you bring in climate issues, because of the vested, powerful interests that are there, it means not only are they going to be threatened and doxxed for doing their job, which is par for the course, it appears now, but they're going to be threatened and doxxed and harassed and undermined because of the fact that they're talking about an issue that, to most people, is actually quite a sane, logical thing, which is climate change is real, folks. We need to be doing X and Y and Z about all of these issues, and there's a whole range of things, and also because it's not one thing. There's a whole range of issues that need to be addressed when you talk about climate change, because it's not just the weather. It's impacting almost every single thing. Food security, poverty levels, the fact that there are floods one week in KZN, and just up the road you've got droughts all over the place. So and being able to have the expertise and the time and the resources to cover that makes it even harder. So you've entered this spiral where for journalists to cover something that's really complex and difficult, they need the time, they need the resources, and they need the protection to do their job so that they don't get threatened and harassed. But then the moment they do, they're going to be threatened and harassed anyway, which means that your pool of journalists that are able to do those stories is again increasingly small. So recently we saw an excellent piece by Amma be about the energy crisis and why we don't actually have load shedding now. And it's the kind of piece of quality journalism you would expect to see or would love to see on a weekly basis. Instead, it's taken months for the journalists to be able to go in and produce that kind of thing. Yeah. And that's just one tiny little aspect of it. Against that, you've got massive, powerful, vested interest lobbies who've got all the money and the resources in the world, it would appear, to attack, undermine, belittle, and demean. And then on top of that heap of excrement, you have the excrementer-in-chief, Elon Musk, who sits there and uses his platform overtly to facilitate mis and disinformation. And in that context, you've got the Media Freedom Coalition, which should in that context be saying, hey, folks, come on now, let's bring these billionaire boys into a room, get them to put their big girl pants on, and start to bring some level of order to understanding the value and importance of media freedom. And that's where they should be asserting their power as the West, right, the global North, in pulling the people that are running and ruining half of our information conversations, calling them to order. They're the only ones that can.
Yeah, sure, got away with words. Do we have the resources for that?
There's many things I could say now, and I want to say. The whole idea, I tried to bring this up in my introduction, is that it's not an instrument of the West or the North or whatever you call it, or, but that, it concerns all of us, and this is why we want this a really global thing and have more partners. So it shouldn't be the South against the West or, whatever kind of antagonism you perceive there, but really something we have a common interest. We have an interest taking what you mentioned, the case of environment. Journalists make the voices of those heard that otherwise are forgotten. Like the ones that are poor and that lose their homes in floods. And a journalist can make those voices heard and present those stories and wake up people, wake up decision makers, influence decision-making processes. And this is what media freedom is about, and what we need to protect. So you also mentioned earlier, you want more meaningful action. You want to see that. The Media Freedom Coalition, of course, issues statements, and with nice words and important, commitments and so on. But that is not all. I mean, statements are important. They call, for the respect for, the safety of journalists in conflicts, for ending impunity. They address the issues that you mentioned and that are important, but there's also behind the scenes action. So not all you see and read and hear is all the action. So there's action you don't actually see, but that can be quite successful. Like we are also aiming at strengthening the diplomatic network. This is why I'm sitting here. So we will have behind the scenes talks about journalists, about imprisoned journalists, about cases that worry us. And we have seen cases where this, I mean, you cannot prove it, obviously, because no government will say, oh, they came to us, they talked to us, now we let them free. But we have seen, like, a timely context where you see, okay, wow, something has worked. And this journalist is free again and safe again. I do agree with you, we need journalists who can cover conflicts. This is also about making voices heard, checking information, giving us information, and those journalists in any conflict or war zone need to be safe. They need to get access. Access needs to be guaranteed, and they need to be safe. I mean, as safe as anyone can be in a conflict, but this is the goal, and this has to be guaranteed. And where it's violated, where there's an attack, yes, there needs to be action. Action means national or international law proceedings in front of a court. And we call upon that. Yes, this concerns Gaza, this concerns also other conflicts, but of course Gaza is the deadliest conflict for journalists. So you mentioned the resolutions, they have been passed. The coalition was speaking in front of the Human Rights Committee 3 weeks ago. And this is also a concern, I would say, to all of us, that journalists, especially in conflict and war zones, are safe. Concerning environment, to come back to that, actually preparing for tonight, I learned a lot. And I learned one shocking number, which is that in the past 15 years, 44 journalists have been killed because they were reporting on environmental issues. And this really shocks me. I mean, it's so important for us. We all depend on that we somehow don't ruin this earth, that it's our living that is concerned. And those journalists need to be able to do their job. We need their information to take decisions, to understand what's going on. And if they are not able to do the job or are afraid to do the job, we are all losing. So this is really very important that they can, show what's going on, and give like a balanced view, contradicting all the misinformation and propaganda and lies we hear when it comes to climate change and environment.
Yeah, because I think it's going to be a growingly decisive issue in our country. And I'm going to bring you in, Sbu, as we move on to another theme. One of the DM earlier, when he introduced the discussion, or I suppose started with his first points, talked about the media being the fourth estate, right? Such an important role that we play. And you almost can't talk about media freedom without speaking about protecting democracy and constitutionalism. For some reason, 30 years into democracy, this is becoming quite a difficult conversation to have. Just a few years ago, you had high-ranking politicians saying that the Constitution simply does not represent the majority of people in our country. So talk to me about whether or not that is becoming a tough thing for journalists to deal with. Constitutionalism, democracy, and then how we start to take that conversation further.
I think the the reality is that with any country like ours, I know that people always say there's a truism that says history always repeats itself, right? In that people forget easily. You know, you hear this in the conversations on platforms like X, when certain freedom fighters or politicians are called sellouts for one decision or the other. And you can see that actually there are these echo chambers, and they're amplified in a way. I think the threat to our democracy is actually not having a strong independent media which is able to counter the rising and the growing and the powerful forces that are pushing disinformation and misinformation. And the reality is that I think for some people, they think that it maybe it's just some innocuous thing where some misinformed person makes one comment or claim. But the reality is that these are actually deliberate distortions. And in countries that have had elections, like countries like Kenya, we've seen violence, which stemmed from the spread of such disinformation. I think, coming back actually to this question, what you are asking is not unrelated to the issue raised earlier about environmental degradation and climate change. That talks to the lack of skills and investment in newsrooms, right? We do not have journalists. I mean, I only know of Tony Kani since the times when I worked in the Mercury in Durban. Today, he's still probably the foremost environmental journalist in this country, but I do not know of any other up-and-coming Tony Kani in this country, right? I think that is the threat to journalism and to media freedom, and by extension to our democracy. And I think that's why it is important that when we talk about global solidarity, when we talk about media sustainability, when we talk about media freedom, we cannot negate, we cannot just talk about the physical conflicts. The reality is that there's a bigger threat, which is not a finger-wagging politician, but actually the fact that you have the newsrooms that have been hollowed out. I mean, I think the only bit that remains in most newsrooms is probably sport, right? And in some newsrooms you'll find there's a little bit of health, there might be education if you're lucky.
The social issues, yeah.
That's it. But the reality is that with the lack of investment in media, in companies, in newsrooms by media owners, you've had that hollowing out of the newsrooms. And I think that actually is the biggest threat, because when you talk about climate change, it's not some abstract or highbrow topic. For the rural people, it's about their food, it's about their planting, it's about the changing seasons, right? There was a time where you know that end of September into October you start planting maize because it's summer. Not anymore, right? So it's actually why it's important to invest in newsrooms and ensure the sustainability of newsrooms is actually creating a pool of journalists who can be able to tell these stories and specialize on issues of climate change, so that they can actually be able to break it down to everyone to understand that this is not just about what's happening in Florida. It's about the changing weather patterns in this country. I mean, I got here just after 6 because there was a mini hailstorm where I was. I had to wait it out, right? Is it the effects of global warming or of climate change? I'm sure it is, but I'm not an expert in it. But I think that when we talk about media sustainability, it's not just about saving newsrooms or saving failing media companies. Media companies that are failing, they're failing, their business model is broken, but it's journalism that we must protect, that we need to sustain going forward, so that we can be able to have an informed citizenry, but also beyond that, to be able to tell these stories of our unfolding South African story and also the global and by extension the African story as well.
Yeah. I'm going to start opening up the floor in about a couple minutes. So if you'd like to prepare or start thinking about your questions, you're more than welcome to do so. But William, I'm going to let you perhaps ask a question to the DM, if you will. Sbu talks about the hollowing out of newsrooms, and I think about how we've seen such a massive decline in investigative journalism in South Africa. I mean, it's huge. I'm not going to name any broadcasters or any sort of media houses, but go in there and where there were offices that were full of investigative journalists, they're completely empty. But I won't name anyone. But let's talk a little bit about how we protect journalists now, William. There's the example of, do you remember when Clicks had that hair ad about, you know, black women's hair being frizzy or something? And then there was a political party that went to protest outside of the store, Clicks. This was actually in the Western Cape. And remember, the argument was around black women's hair. And a black woman happened to be there covering the story as a journalist. And she was shoved around by those that were protesting. And I don't know if that got enough attention. That a woman was shoved and pushed on national television for everyone to see while covering a story that, you know, impacts people that look just like her. Was there enough said? Is enough said when things go wrong with journalists, William? Is enough done?
Short answer, no. We saw in the lead up to elections, journalists being threatened and harassed, and you don't even see the political parties, the heads of the relevant party coming and standing out and saying, hey, this is unacceptable behavior. We're not going to tolerate it, even though it's a clear breach of the electoral code of conduct. So I think that part of why I hope, and the part of the question to the Deputy Minister is I hope that South Africa will soon be sending a note to the Media Freedom Coalition to say, when can we join? Please send us the membership form. But it is about saying, it's good that we've got the protections, but when do we assert the clear condemnation of journalists that are being attacked? If you think of the journalists that have been attacked and threatened in Parliament, and yet the Speaker of Parliament all too often has not come out and said, folks, this is not acceptable behavior, and made a thing of it when they've got the power and the possibility of doing that. The Portfolio Committee on Communications, they don't come out and say, we need to make sure that we protect our journalists and facilitate them doing their jobs. And then when we are seeing journalists being attacked in different environments, again, part of the role of government is precisely to make sure that they can and do that. So I guess the question for, given his role in GCIS is could it be a standing order? And I understand from some of the fine people there that they do issue a lot of press releases when journalists are being harassed and threatened, but perhaps we can be doing more to ensure that their protection is given a lot more prominence, let's say.
Yeah. So a lot of asks there for you, Deputy Minister, right? Around how government needs to speak out more around the harassment of journalists. Hopefully that being coupled with some action, and you can talk to us about that. And then any keenness or discussion around joining the Media Freedom Coalition.
Well, I think the Media Freedom Coalition is an important platform that must be supported. And I think that conversation is quite important for government to engage in. And I think without making any promises that I have no express mandate of making, there would be such a discussion, and I think it will have to culminate in some action on the side of government. But South Africa is a constitutional democracy. There is a high degree of respect for the rule of law. Our criminal justice system is resilient, and we will protect the rights of all South Africans, especially journalists who are harassed while exercising their responsibilities at work or wherever they are. And we think that there must be condemnation of any act of abuse of journalists, and all political parties should join in that condemnation of work, including party leaders whose members are seen to be harassing journalists or taking journalists in any form of or another. And I think I speak on behalf of government when I say government advocates for for the rights and the freedom of the press. And it will be this government that will continue to advocate for the defense and protection of journalists.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. Okay, we're going to take some questions now. I'm actually just going to walk around and bring them to you. You know, when Professor Anton Harber puts his hand up, it's about to get hot. It's okay, I got it. Prof?
Now you've challenged me. I want to talk to the Deputy Minister and pick up on what William has said, because I don't think we can be satisfied with loose, generalized commitments to media freedom. We need to talk specifics. We released a report this morning on the state of free expression in South Africa, which gives, I think, a strong factual basis for real concern about the many threats we're seeing to our freedom of expression generally. One of those highlighted was the increasing number of slap cases, the use of the law, the weaponization of the law to harass and intimidate journalists and try and make it more difficult, if not impossible, to do their work. It's a global phenomenon, and there's a global movement to act against it, and we're seeing it rise here. We went through many instances this morning of what a concerning phenomenon it is. I want to ask you, if we come to you with a draft anti-slap law that looks to make it more difficult for people to weaponize the law against journalists and activists in that way, would you take a serious consideration of adopting it?
I would literally take it to Parliament as a private member's bill, undoubtedly, because of our long-term commitment to media freedom. We are a country that has never, from time immemorial, I mean, since the establishment of our democratic government in 1994, never sought to undermine media freedom. It was actually Nelson Mandela who reminded us of the importance of media freedom when he took over as president in 1994. And we continue to walk in the footsteps of many other giants. Remember, our own democracy was founded, amongst others, on the grounds of the work that was done through radio freedom and many other platforms. We sought to galvanize our people against the brutality of the apartheid regime. So I can guarantee you that under this government, we will continue to strengthen laws that will give protection to free journalism.
I shall send you the draft shortly. Thank you very much.
Anton, I'll drive you to the Union buildings.
There we go. William, are you in as well? Yeah. Anyone else with a question? Okay. And do give us your name and your who you're with.
Hi, thank you. I'm Karine du Plessis. I work for the Africa Report. I have a question, perhaps, Deputy Minister, now that you're here as well. A question about solidarity with other journalists on the continent. We often sort of look far away when there's conflicts and when there's media repression. But we don't, I don't know, I sometimes feel we lack solidarity at home. And I want to know from you, for instance, what do our diplomats, our ambassadors do in terms of quiet diplomacy, perhaps, if it can't be sort of outspoken diplomacy? What do they do when journalists have a tough time in other countries? I mean, from traveling the continent, I've realized we are really, really privileged in South Africa with our media freedom laws. We're not perfect, but we have so much freedom. And a lot of journalists elsewhere on the continent really envy us for that. So I'm just wondering if we do see practices elsewhere that are sort of suppressing media freedom, what do we do? And also, us as journalists in South Africa, what do we do to show solidarity with our colleagues? I know a colleague who is in Germany at the moment because he is in trouble at home in his country, and he's there on a short visa to do a course, but it's provided him a break to get away from that. What do we do to facilitate the same in South Africa? I don't know, Anton, I think you might be able to speak to that. But yeah, just solidarity to him. And what do we do to report on stories that are difficult for our colleagues to report on? Zimbabwe, Mozambique elections, Swaziland. What do we as media houses do locally to show that kind of solidarity? Thank you.
DM?
Well, I think, as we said, that we are promoters of a global peace, of equitable world order. And mission to mission, our ambassadors will continue to engage their counterparts to express our views and concerns on any violation of any kind, including generally on violation of broadly human rights that we experience in the countries where we have missions and where we are able to, from time to time, interact with the ambassadors. So I think that will continue. We will also continue to use other platforms, such as our leadership and our presence in the BRICS community, to really continue to express our disgust at these occurrences where journalists are attacked and harassed. We will also use our G20 presidency next year to talk about the promotion of the global world order. We will do that mindful of the fact that when we advance such messaging, we are also protecting the freedom of the press. We are also protecting the freedom of those who are South African journalists who may eventually land up in other countries to do stories on behalf of their respective media houses. So we think that that sense of global solidarity is important to advance media freedom.
Thank you. My name's Roshan Dadu. I'm from the South African BDS Coalition, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. South African because in Germany, I'm not sure I would be able to be amongst you, as they have recently classified the BDS movement as extremist, and I expect that has an impact also on media reporting, as well as on the movement and the right to boycott, divest and demand sanctions against the apartheid and genocidal state of Israel. Secondly, I just wanted to say, I thank you for the people on the panel who have raised the question of what is happening in Gaza, what's happening to the Palestinian journalists. The banner there somehow conflicts with me in reading Media Freedom Festival 2024 in a year when we've witnessed, it's unprecedented. This is the highest number of journalists ever killed in a war. And so the kind of contrast is rather striking, as was no mention of this in the information on the website or in the information around this discussion about solidarity and about protection of journalists' rights. But I just wanted to quickly mention two things. One, on patriotic journalism. I echo the fact of people who've said the hollowing out of the newsrooms is a real problem, and the lack of investigative journalists now. It is a real problem, partly because that means a lot of the media takes word for word Western mainstream media and repeats it point blank, like Reuters reports on what they call the conflict. It's not a conflict, it's a genocide, and so on. Western media is not neutral in the way it's worded, and that reflects not only in Africa, but also when we've been in interviews recently in Nigeria, those same framings, Western framings of, I'm talking in particular of the genocide that's taking place in Palestine, they reflected in our continent when we don't have the capacity to do that investigation. But yesterday there was really excellent patriotic piece, investigative piece in News 24 that exposed the fact of a South African who's fighting in one of these horrendous elite sniper units that's been exposed by Palestinian journalists recently on X. And they had looked into it, they had got the names, they'd got all the details, the background, and that really helps because now we can push the National Prosecuting Authority to investigate, and that's mostly been done by the journalist, and prosecute because they're contravening our domestic Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. So that was, just an example of how journalism and activism, when there is that capacity, can really assist each other in a patriotic way, because this is in defense of ensuring our domestic legislation is adhered to, as well as, of course, of international law, and particularly the findings, the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice. And then I just wanted to quickly touch upon this idea of balance and ask the panel, if you were interviewing Mandela during apartheid, would you insist on interviewing a P.W. Botha or a real strong supporter of apartheid? Would you refuse to interview Madiba unless you could find the balance from the apartheid side? Because that is what is happening also in South Africa. It's happened to me, where we put a press release, it's picked up, it's an interesting story, they call and say, we want to interview you, then they go back and say, oh no, we can't find someone from the other side, and so we can't interview you. And really, it is an apartheid state, that's clear. I think there's general consensus internationally. And so I want to ask that question, whether you would, as journalists, not interview Madiba unless you could find an apartheid supporter of note to counter that. Thanks.
Those are very powerful points. Thank you so much for that. And I think I'm going to let you guys respond to that at the end. And perhaps, Bianca, you can talk to us a little bit about the issue around the geopolitics and where we sit with that. But the question around balance, Sbu, perhaps you can take that one, right?
All right. I think the reality is that the issue of Middle East is actually quite a complex issue that South African journalists, I would argue, do not fully understand. So the easiest way out, also because of how polarized and also how powerful the voices are on both sides of, on the opposite sides of the political divide, perhaps for most newsrooms not to get in trouble, the easiest way is to just say he said, she said, and then the other side said, and then there's some kind of a false sense of balance. And I agree with you that if you interview somebody, it's their story. They're telling their story, and yes, you can fact check it, but not every story lends itself to you having to get the other side. But the reality is that I think for me, it also goes back to the very point I make about lack of investment in newsroom and lack of depth in newsrooms, where you have journalists that are strong enough to put their view across and to actually be able to defend their view. Because if you issue a statement, I can tell you now, in most newsrooms, if you issue a statement as BDS or whoever else, the person who's going to pick up that a press release is probably the most junior of journalists in the newsroom, because somebody must turn it quickly, right? You have to just write a quick story, let's turn it, okay, because we've got a bulletin at the top of the hour. So, and the fundamental things that, okay, I was told to balance the story. So I don't understand this, and these are powerful voices, maybe I need to get the other side. So I think it talks to the very point I was making initially about the lack of depth in newsrooms and why a strong independent media is actually not a nice to have, but a fundamental feature of a democratic society. I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming and also for voicing your concerns. I'm not sure how much German media you actually read or listen to or, watch on a daily basis. But I can assure you there's not one opinion voiced in German, what you call mainstream Western media. There's many different opinions voiced. Put, different sides of how to see things, but also very, very fierce arguments, especially on what we've been seeing since 7 October 2023 in Israel and Gaza. and you were concerned about media freedom and freedom of expression in Germany. There's been around 2,000 public demonstrations in Germany on the situation in the Middle East. So, you know, solidarity demonstrations with Israel, but many more also the opposite. So you will see people take their opinions to the street, and of course they're allowed to do this, right? So this is freedom of demonstration, freedom of opinion. This is, you know, but this is also important when we speak about freedom of media. Didn't quite get whether you are a journalist. No. Okay. I thought so. Or I thought earlier you were a journalist. So we protect the freedom of expression as well as the freedom of media. Of course, there's a line at some point, where it becomes, an offense against another person. Of course, freedom of expression is not without boundaries because there are other people. So this needs to be put in balance. So like hate speech, for example, this is where you reach a boundary of freedom of expression or freedom of media. This is just because in Germany we have this discussion sometimes where people say, okay, but it's my freedom of speech. But if you're offending another person with hate speech or, in a way that becomes like an offense, then this is, the end of freedom of media. No freedom can be without borders, because we live together in a society, and other people are concerned. I did say something earlier on the journalists being killed in Gaza, and let me just repeat, each journalist killed in a conflict is one too many. To just give you a clear answer on that too.
Okay.
Hello, I'm a former journalist who did a lot of twittering as Ziggo Brandberg, and also on the odd radio. I managed to sometimes, infrequently, mostly I'm blocked to get through to the radio, because maybe I'm just a boring loudmouth. So there is this element that we don't have a lot of free speech, but we have a lot of stupid speech of people who are very ignorant, who have free access to the radio waves, and they're bringing about false impressions of reality in South Africa about who the land belonged to and currently belongs to and should belong to, for example, and how it should be taken away because capitalism is horrible anyway also, and stuff like that, which is really undermining the essence of democratic societies across the world which are suffering. So what we need to do is not live in an ivory tower here. We must go back to reality, and one of the realities is that we've got total anarchy and crime being committed by our, according to an allegation that's currently circulating, by our premier of the Gauteng, who was party to spending 11 billion rands on a major housing project which is totally collapsed and it's being dismantled, and we see it on Twitter. You can see this thing. And there's kidnappings galore all over the place, and there's other extortions everywhere, and BEE extortions continue, and nothing is happening. Tuli Madonsela was a hero who had to save us, and nothing's happened to her outcome of the Zondo Commission. It's still lying there, and we've got new crimes like the student loans, and I'm amazed that the students aren't uprising.
Thank you so much for that. Lots to cover, you see? Lots of work for journalists to do. I'm going to let our panelists have the last bite, and perhaps as we wrap up, William, you'd like to respond to some of the points that have been made by our audience, and then really what we take out of this discussion. I always like to, when we end a conversation, talk about the commitment that we make to ourselves as we leave this conversation. William?
So South Africa is a wonderful place because it's a living contradiction, right? We've got the best things and the worst of things all at the same time, and our news ecosystem is just like that, right? We've got some of the most amazing, incredible, brilliant journalists, comparable with the best anywhere in the world, right? Easily, like brilliant investigations, brilliant all sorts of things. They can be the best, and they can also just be completely crap, right? And all too frequently completely crap. And the thing about that is that contradiction is fine in South Africa, where you've got the best and worst, but it means that what it does is it undermines journalism, and it undermines integrity, and it undermines trust. And then it feeds into broader stereotypes. So think about the Lusikisiki killing, the mass killing of people. Understanding why that happened and what's actually behind that. We're so used to violence in South Africa that we just kind of think, oh, well, another 17 people died. Whoopsie daisy. Like, they had a bad weekend. There was a period recently of weekend clashes again. The last time we saw that kind of terminology being used was in the mid to late 90s, when people were being killed in a low-level civil war in KZN, when every week on Monday, SABC News would start off the headline, 15 people died in weekend clashes, like it was football, right? 5 died here, 6 there, etc. And then ENCA would have a wailing black woman crying as their underlying theme to support that. And I say that because it buys into all of the stereotypes about the media, and then it helps those that are seeking to undermine the media. So you need two of those things to happen. You need media quality to be improved. For that, you need investment. But for that, you need government meaningfully to support. And I wasn't making a dig about the West, but I'm talking about inequitable resources, right? The fact that we need those resources to be supporting organizations that are going to be the bastions of media freedom. Because for all that we've got our challenges, if you look, I'm so pleased Anton raised the SLAP thing. Our courts have been at the forefront around protecting media freedom in South Africa. Every instance they've come up trumps, particularly our Constitutional Court, even on issues like SLAP suits. They've led the world in access to criminal cases in terms of the open justice issues. So they are leading the world in many respects on these things. But then we need to back that up with support and supporting our news organizations.
I think the first point is to say that stupid people also have a right to speak. And I think that's the reality of having a free society where everyone has an opinion, but it's always important to have strong fact-checking, and also if that information can be debunked, then you have a media that does that. But I think the important thing here is that this coalition is actually a good, noble idea. And I made this point earlier that we actually need more countries, not just 50. Right? We need more countries buying into it and supporting it. And I'm encouraged by what the Deputy Minister said, although he was careful lest he became like Opet Bapela. I take that TM. So I think it's actually an important one. And I think the more you have governments, and also, I mean, we've got very strong civil society in this country. The more you have governments actually taking up the fight for media freedom, right? We may question them, we may criticize, but the reality is that it's actually a good thing. And if you can have it, because most of the time we're crying out in a deep hole with no one hearing. Right, but if you have it at the government-to-government level, also pushed by your embassies or by the diplomatic corps, then it means that there's another area of influence for us as the media, where we can nudge somebody to make something happen. So I think that the more we have these conversations, the more we have these coalitions. The reality is that, yes, let's move beyond statements. let's take more meaningful action. Let's be able to see the action in terms of protecting media rights and actually making sure that we have a sustainable media, not in South Africa, but in Africa and the world.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. All right. The Deputy Minister, I'm going to let you have your last bite. Closing thoughts and commitments made.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are making a commitment that we will look at joining the coalition. It's a noble cause, as it has been said. But we consider media freedom as an important pillar of our democracy, and we will continue to promote free press, and in all instances where the victimization of journalists rear its ugly head, will be the first one as government to condemn such an attack, but also to ensure that there is action taken against the perpetrators of these hideous acts.
Thank you, dear. Bianca, your final closing thoughts.
Thank you. You said pretty much everything I would have said. I want to maybe, if need be, clarify one more thing. The media freedom and the Media Freedom Coalition strengthening or protecting or advocating media freedom is not about a certain narrative. It's about giving journalists, among others, the right to criticize governments. So it may sound a bit illogic, but as governments, we unite to and collaborate with the NGOs to give the journalists and also anyone else working in media the right to criticize us, because this is important to take better decisions. So governments need to be criticized to really justify their actions, be transparent, and include the voices of people, like you were mentioning. It's about the food of the people who are hit by floods. People who are normally not heard. So this is what it's about. It's not about us, looking for an echo for our government policies, but rather the opposite, to get the enrichment by media freedom and to make sure, media can do what it's supposed to do. And this includes criticizing governments. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you so much for making time to be part of our panel. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Deputy Minister in the Presidency, Kenneth Morolong. Thank you so much to the Director for Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird, the Treasurer for SANEF, as well as the African Editors Forum, Mr. Smungalwa, as well as Bianca Domuth, who's the Head of the Political Department at the German Embassy. I'm Naledi Mulao. Guys, thank you. Give yourselves a warm round of applause. We really appreciated your time. Spence, have a couple of drinks, mingle, have a few chats, and then have yourselves a great week ahead, okay?
Don't jump up yet. Can we give Naledi a huge round of applause, please? So here, for those of you supporters of independent media, you can see us handing out bags of cash to the people that are speaking, because clearly that's what we do. We're going to need a picture of you all. So in just a moment. Just a quick throw forward to the next few days. Tomorrow is a fabulous session looking at elections, looking at what's happened this year and what we're going to expect in 2026. In the afternoon, we've got a session dealing with mental health and journalists. I think that's pretty much full, so if you haven't registered, it's too late now. But in the evening, we're going to be looking at the thorny issue of hate speech, and it's going to be really cool and fun. We've got fabulous people participating in that, including Advocate Ben Winks, to help us unpack what hate speech looks like. Then, just to end off, I want to thank all of our fabulous partners for this. Thank you very much to our friends at the German Embassy. Thank you to our friends and partners, SANEF, Campaign for Freedom of Expression, SOS, GCIS. They've got a fabulous event on Thursday in the morning. 30 years of democracy, a lot to celebrate and some serious issues to face. And then in the evening on Thursday, also just a quick throw forward then, we are looking at media sustainability. So don't go around. There's a ton of excellent stuff still to come. So thank you very much for being with us. And thank you to all of our partners. We really appreciate it. Oh, wait, I've got to say one thing apparently. Piriana. Okay, if you're not Gen Z, you don't know what that means. Pretty much like me. Okay, let's get some pictures, please. Let's huddle, let's huddle.
That's it.
Stomachs in, chest out.
That's right.